David, thanks for doing this interview. You were on a panel that was discussing Canada's Arctic and Northern Science Policy Strategy, or lack thereof.
Well, and Canadian responsibilities, broadly speaking, in the North and in the Arctic, right?
Awesome. Specifically, I wanted to ask you about the concrete sorts of strategies or policies that might be implemented in the North or that currently are implemented there.
Right.
One of the things that many people said about the panel that you were on was that it's such a large, complicated nexus of issues that it was difficult for the four panelists to talk about any of the concrete policy issues that are going on in the Arctic.
Right.
So I was hoping that you might even just be able to address a little bit of that here.
Well, I think we're fortunate in having a Government of Canada Northern strategy that's clearly articulated four pillars related to sovereignty and economic development, social development, governance, and an acknowledgement that underlying everything that we do in the North is a need for good information knowledge based on sound science. So that's been, for the last decade, clearly articulated, and in a sense it's been fairly straightforward for the science community to develop research programs, to implement opportunities as they've arose, with the support of funding agencies, government departments. So for example, the International Polar Year, which we just completed in 2007-2009, in Canada we had a contribution of over $150 million to that large international program, 63 countries and over 200 projects and 50,000 participants, and we really led the way in many respects. I don't think that would have been possible given all of the other issues in the North, housing, healthcare, education, infrastructure, if there hadn't been that fundamental acknowledgement by the Government of Canada and by the territorial governments and even by Indigenous peoples organizations in the North, never mind the rest of the country, that the science is a foundation for understanding what the changes are and how to deal with them.
So going forward in terms of Canada's scientific study and policy regimes in the North, what do you think is the most imperative sort of actions that we should be taking?
Right. Well, I think there's a number of things. Let me address what I think is the most important issue,
Please.
I guess personally. That is that in order for Arctic science in Northern Canada to be successful, there's three elements. There's infrastructure. It's very difficult to do this work without access to aircraft or research stations or icebreakers, or community infrastructure. And then that leads to the second requirement, which is the logistic support, the funding to actually get to a place and stay there at the time of year when you need to be in the field. And then thirdly, the program funding, to know that we have resources in place for training students, for hiring support staff, and for running the program for the course of a project. And those three things need to line up. Now, sometimes we can do that with programs like ArcticNet, an NCE that brings all those elements together. Sometimes we can do it with something like IPY, but that's a 50-year event, so we don't want to rely on that. But through normal programs, granting councils, government departments, other agencies that support science, sometimes there's a misalignment of program funding, infrastructure, and logistics. And they're all critical and all necessary. And I think what a policy would help to ensure is that those three pieces are in place at the same time.
It's coordination is the key.
It's a coordination function and partly an accountability function as well. It ensures that there's a dialogue between the different organizations and agencies that are active in Northern research. Accountability in terms of addressing critical questions at the right time, accountability in terms of maximizing the bang for the buck in how we spend dollars, and accountability to the North. Because one of the things I discussed today was the critical issue of building capacity in the North, within the territorial governments, within the communities, within the Aboriginal organizations, so that Northerners can play a much greater role in participating in research and scientific activities in the place where they live.
So you're also associated with the Canadian Circumpolar Institute in Edmonton?
The Canadian Circumpolar Institute is a University of Alberta institute that works at a local level to coordinate activities in the Canadian North. And it's one of a number of university-based institutes in Canada that provide a very strong link with what's happening in the international science community. So this is important because, you know, Canada has a large part of the Arctic, but our ability to understand the rapid change that's taking place means we have to really have a good picture of the whole of the Arctic region. And we can only do that if we collaborate closely with our colleagues in other countries. So the universities and the university institutes are a good way to facilitate some of that interaction.
Interesting. So is Edmonton much of a center for policy discourse, or is this more of just a scientific facilitator?
Oh, I think Edmonton is a little bit of a gateway to much of the North in terms of the resource sector, a lot of exchange around education and health services. So there's a lot of Northerners that come through Edmonton, government officials, but businessmen and just general members of the public coming through. And we have contact with a lot of people who are interested in these questions of how do we organize ourselves in the North, in Northern Canada, and participate in these Arctic and polar initiatives and ensure that we can do that in a sustainable way. So whether we're just, it's very hard to work in the North and just be narrowly focused on your own research interest or your own business interest. You immediately become engaged and in these lively discussions about, well, how do we do this better? What can we do in the future? What are the consequences of the change in the Arctic going to mean for the things that I'm interested in? So Edmonton's a pretty lively place. The university itself has a critical mass of researchers involved in all aspects of social, health, natural sciences, but at the same time we have these very strong connections with the communities in the North and the institutions in the North as well.
Sounds like an interesting place to be.
It's a very lively place right now. Yeah.
So you're here at the conference. Obviously you see some sort of benefit to events like this in creating a strategy for Arctic policy or science policy in the North. What exactly do you think would be the best outcome from an event like this, or the best input from an event like this to progressive policies in the North?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I guess on one hand, I wouldn't want to entirely separate an Arctic science policy from a national dialogue about science and policy. So it's not really sectoral, it's regional in the sense that it covers all of the various interests that we have as a country and that Northerners might have. So I think embedding a Northern perspective in the broader national dialogue in all aspects of that would be a very good outcome of a panel like the one we had this morning. In a sense, sort of raising the center of gravity of the country a little bit further north, so that the North isn't, oh yeah, we have to remember the North as well, but that it's half the country, small population, but in many ways the future of the sorts of issues that we're going to need to deal with in the next century, and not to have it as sort of a secondary afterthought, but to embed it in the dialogue that we have about a whole range of issues, so that the North isn't, that there are special issues that apply to the North, but it's not that different from the national dialogue and the other discussions that I've heard here today.
That's very, very interesting. Thank you very much.
You're very welcome.